When the United States decided to tighten restrictions on Russian seaborne oil, it disrupted a massive physical market. A policy drafted in Washington travels through contested maritime routes in the Middle East and eventually hits receiving refineries in places like India. This shift serves as a severe stress test for the entire global energy system, exposing risks that remain hidden during periods of relative geopolitical stability. Western sanctions policy currently holds two contradictory goals. On one side, the objective is to starve a major exporter of revenue. On the other, policymakers are attempting to mandate lower global inflation and uninterrupted fuel flows. These objectives inevitably collide. You cannot drastically tighten global supply balances while simultaneously expecting prices to remain stable. Political decisions, no matter how forceful, cannot suspend the basic macroeconomic laws of supply and demand. For a nation like India, which imports roughly 90% of its crude oil, this stress test exposes a critical vulnerability. Historically, national energy security was a straightforward concept. It was almost exclusively about securing physical access to raw materials and getting barrels to port. Today, that framework is obsolete. The shape of energy security has fractured. A nation's vulnerabilities are now deeply entangled with the global financial architecture, maritime security threats, and complex insurance controls. An importer can successfully secure the physical commodity, but still suffer extreme economic disruption because of friction in secondary markets. To understand the true threat to import-dependent economies, we have to look specifically at how an abstract geopolitical policy physically forces its way into a domestic economy. This table details how modern energy disruptions transmit through interconnected channels into India's economy. The first row isolates the most obvious mechanism, an increase in global crude oil prices. Costlier imports act as an unavoidable tax on the nation's purchasing power. This triggers a secondary macroeconomic effect. Paying more for those imports puts direct downward pressure on the rupee, which then feeds broad inflation across the domestic economy. But price is only part of the equation. Even if the baseline cost of oil remains stable, logistical friction acts as a secondary multiplier. The raw price of the commodity is strictly the first, and often most visible, layer of an economic shock. The second mechanism involves physical blockades at critical maritime choke points, particularly the Strait of Hormuz. When navigating these regions becomes uncertain, it specifically stresses the downstream logistics for refined products like liquid petroleum gas and specialized fuels. Looking at the third row, we move from physical geography to financial friction, a sudden surge in shipping insurance premiums. There's a vital difference between market price and final landed cost. Insurance spikes and freight disruptions artificially inflate what the importer actually pays. As the fourth row indicates, when cargoes are delayed, that lag inflicts immediate compounding strain on domestic inventory and stock management systems. Insurance weaponization and maritime delays function as a hidden, devastating tax on emerging economies, completely bypassing standard commodity markets. The final mechanism shown here details the direct restrictions on Russian crude supply. Since 2022, Russian oil flowing into Asia has served a specific function. It operated as a critical diversification mechanism. Having access to this alternative market functioned as an economic stabilizer, moderating overall inflationary pressures across the region. Removing that stabilizer has severe operational consequences. Domestic refineries operate on highly rigid timelines. Without flexible alternatives, they are forced to accept higher sourcing costs and rely on increasingly volatile regional producers. When sanctions target a major producer, they inevitably erode the operational flexibility and economic resilience of the consumer. Zooming out to the broader geopolitical landscape, a harsh reality emerges. Energy systems strictly obey physical laws, not political rhetoric. Regardless of the sanctions drafted in Western capitals, tankers must move across the oceans, and domestic economies must continue to function. Global trade has fractured into a system defined by strategic rivalries and competing political blocs, moving away from pure free market economics. In this environment, relying on opportunistic spot buying or tying an economy entirely to a single geopolitical camp carries fatal long-term risks for any importing nation. Supply chain disruptions are no longer temporary anomalies. They are permanent, recurring features of the 21st century economic landscape. For nations like India, the mandatory response framework requires abandoning reactionary tactics and building deep structural resilience. This means making immediate physical adaptations, aggressively expanding strategic petroleum reserves, and strengthening domestic exploration. It also demands operational shifts, like accelerating natural gas infrastructure and securing alternative hardened maritime pathways. But above all, it requires a strict geopolitical posture, the absolute preservation of strategic autonomy in domestic decision-making. True economic sovereignty now depends entirely on a nation's ability to navigate a permanent state of global fragmentation and continuous market shocks.